This reflection will be based on the last 3 sections of Chapter 1, A Mystery to be Lived, pages 14 through 20, beginning with a child and his mother. So some years ago, when my first niece was very little and still an only child, she and I were in the kitchen together when she pulled something from a drawer so quickly that it hit her in the mouth, and she looked right at me, even before reacting herself, as if she were looking to me to tell her how to respond. The thing shocked me too. I wasn't expecting it, and I thought she may well be very hurt, but somehow I knew to smile gently and say, it's okay, and then, come here, I got you. And she cried a little, but she was fine. The wounds remain untreated, the pain has not disappeared, but something has happened that the child is no longer suffering. Why? That's how Monsignor begins this section, A Child and His Mother. He's speaking of how the child runs to his mother in his pain. And even if at first the cry intensifies, the pain subsides in her embrace, her response to his suffering. And he speaks in this section of how the child not only cries to his mother for comfort, but also because there's something about suffering that's just not right. The child, he's saying, has a deep sense that suffering shouldn't be. This is the why. This is the cry. And it's the mother that we run to because the mother reminds us of everything that is good and beautiful in this world. This is why we cry to our mother. This cry is the natural human response to evil. When my niece hurt herself, she looked at me as if not so much to ask what happened, but why. Like, why did this thing hit me in the mouth? But this, Monsignor says, leads to what he, on page 16, calls real healing. Real healing, he says, takes place when the spiritual dimension of suffering is dealt with. And then he says, this is why health care appropriate for human beings must seek the relief of suffering, which may occur even if it is not possible to relieve physical or psychological pain directly. So again, when Monsignor speaks of suffering, he's really speaking about the human cry of the heart in the midst of pain or some evil, something that shouldn't be, but not just the physical or psychological pain, but the suffering, the experience of human suffering, okay? So that's an important distinction to make between this pain and suffering. That's why he's able to say health care appropriate for human beings must seek the relief of suffering. He wants like spiritual healing of the soul to help, even if it's not possible to relieve physical or psychological pain directly. All right. Remember the question he asked in his journal, again at San Giovanni Rotondo, about his mother's condition? Suppose my mother was in that hospital, Padre Pio's hospital. Would I experience the involvement of God more than at St. Elizabeth's by looking outside and not seeing Boston, the world of human pretension, but the world of human need gathered because God acted here in the life of Padre Pio? It may seem like a stretch, but I think Monsignor knows just how helpful it can be in terms of aiding and healing and relieving suffering, to be able to look to people in our suffering who can change the way we look at it. Like a child who looks to his mother for a soothing touch with a love that, he says, shares her son's burdens and thus lightens them. Let me share with you that I fell ill just before returning home from a trip to the Philippines one year. I had traveled there with my parents. And although you're not supposed to board a flight with an undiagnosed illness, I did. I didn't want to get stuck in the Philippines. And when we took off from South Korea, I began what I was sure was going to be the longest 14-hour flight of my life. I had a fever and the chills. And although no amount of medicine or number of blankets could help me, my mother could. She sat next to me, told me to put my head in her lap, and she gently caressed my temple with the back of her hand for 14 hours. And that did help. Her touch soothed the wound in my soul, and her touch lightened the burden of my suffering. Now, Lorenzo's brief word on the freedom to love, which begins on page 17, may be the most difficult of his thoughts to grasp from among those we've looked at so far. And I'm sure that my words here will, at best, partially illuminate what he's saying, but I'll try. So just quickly, he's going to use the word redemption But although we use the word all the time as Catholics, I don't think we all think of it in the same way. For the sake of staying together here, let's think of redemption as giving value to something that would otherwise have no value, like a coupon. Outside of the store, it has no value. It's a useless piece of paper. But the store can give it value. Now, Monsignor understands that human suffering is like that coupon. It has no value apart from God, but God can redeem it, can give it value. All right, now for page 17. It seems to me that he's pondering the way that love opens up in us the capacity for freedom, and that freedom is the capacity for the infinite, the deepest identity of the human person. Now, the subtitle of Monsignor's book, God at the Ritz, which we've spoken about a little, is Attraction to Infinity. Attraction to it. And he uses that expression here in this section of Cry of the Heart on page 17, when he says, I can be rescued only when the attraction to infinity wins over whatever is attracting me away from it. This, he says, is the redemption of my freedom. And if we remember that he says that love opens up this capacity for freedom, then it follows that love is what redeems our attraction to infinity, which is our longing for God. So he says it much better than I do. He says, the identity of God must be expressed as the infinite love revealed through co-suffering with humankind. All right, I feel like it's just best to move on, but I think we might be able to tie it all together in this last little part. That's when he moves into the last section of this chapter entitled A Transforming Event. The transforming event is the love of God that comes to us in the form of grace, or is described as grace, which is infinite. Actually, he's saying something even more. He's saying that it's God himself who comes to us in that experience of grace. It's not that he sends his love per se, like an emissary, but that he is present in that love. Now, on page 18, he says, human beings can humbly co-suffer with those whom they love, but in the end, this co-suffering can only be limited. Right? It's not the infinite. He's saying we are still not stronger than death, which seems always to have the last word. But, he says, what if the co-sufferer is the author of our identity? Remember, our deepest identity is our attraction to infinity. Then, he says, this co-suffering would be stronger than death. Redemption, Albacete is saying, does not eliminate suffering. Right? He says it's not an absolute answer to a problem. It's not going to eliminate it. That's not the redemption we're looking for. Rather, suffering, he says, is an invitation to free human beings to embrace a new vocation. So he sees this redemption in the soul of the person who is truly free to long for the infinite, and who is willing to set out on the adventure of seeking the fulfillment of that desire. So this is what we mean when we say that we see people who are suffering with a heart that is open to God, and they even, although they would never wish it for anyone else, permit graces to flow into their life and the lives of those whom they love through this experience of suffering. These are people who are truly free because they're not looking for something to shut down the experience of suffering or to help them escape from it. They're not looking for an absolute answer to it as if to a problem. These are people who live by that freedom in man, which is the attraction to infinity, which is longing for God. So I think what all this means is that unless suffering open up for us a way to God, then it is still unredeemed. And if it's unredeemed, it's still useless. And then the man on the cross, by the way, would mean nothing if suffering is not redeemed. You know? And it should be eliminated if Christ didn't redeem it on the cross. But if suffering is redeemed, as we say it is, then it has become a doorway to the infinite, which is why, as we'll read in the next chapter, some of the most valuable insights into our own humanity have come through those who have confronted the experience of suffering head on. We'll continue at the beginning of the second chapter, You Cannot Love What Shocks You, and proceed from pages 21 through 27 of Albacete's Cry of the Heart in the next reflection.